Koreans love to drink, but not everybody wants to get pissed. Well, not all the time anyway. Sometimes a bit of culture would be suffice for an evening. How about a visit to a cinema? Going to a cinema is definitely one of the nation's favorite pastime. Right up to 2020, when all the hell broke out, a Korean visited a cinema in average more than 4 times a year, and the cinemas were a growing business both in terms of the audience and number of screens. It is probably no surprise, considering the country has a pretty successful film industry. But just like any other typical nightlife venues, as you've seen in the past episodes, cinemas are also plagued with various inexplicable and even clearly paranormal sightings. Not just in old dingy ones, but even from big brand new multiplex cinemas too. I remember reading an anthropologist comparing the experience of going to a cinema to discovering an ancient temple. Going through a dark, narrow hallways to reach the big open space where a new kind of discovery awaits. But if you put that image to more paranormal context, it's not too difficult to imagine why ghosts would enjoy being in cinemas. A space that is kept dark at all times, where the only light is the flickering illusions of images from the projector. On top of that, if it's a midnight screening of a horror film? So, today here are a small collection of stories from Korean cinemas. Most of them are short anecdotal stories, but there is also one strange true case that took place in a cinema. As always, handpicked, translated and narrated by your host, Anthony. I avoid going to an empty cinema. Even if I booked a ticket ahead, I would rather cancel it on the day when other seats should be empty. Here's why. Last summer on a visit to a nearby city, I decided to go to a cinema there. I'm a big fan of Chris Pine, and his new film, Hell or High Water, had just been released. It was at one of those franchise multiplex theater, but it was the first time for me to visit there, and I found it difficult to find a way through narrow street full of small restaurants. The cinema at the top floor of a high-rise building was practically empty and quiet. Well, it was a weekday afternoon after all. I was already a few minutes late by the time I got there. I quickly looked up my seat. The film was already on. Maybe they cut the usual lengthy commercials when there are just a few audiences, I thought. Which, in this case, were about 4 or 5 people from what I could make out with a quick browsing. In the front row of my left, could I see a person's arm resting on the armrest? Behind me on the right was what seemed like a head of a woman whose face was obscured by the high backs of the seats. They all seemed women, and I just thought to myself, hello, fellow Chris Pine fans, but how sad there are just so few of us here. All the while the auditorium was dead silent, right to the moment of ending credit. Even while the credit was rolling and the light was back on, nobody seemed getting up. I again thought to myself, my respect to fellow Chris Pine fanatics. When the screen finally went off, I got up and thought to have a look at the faces of fellow fans. There were none. I was all alone in the whole auditorium. I didn't hear anybody going out. I actually didn't hear any bustling noises at all. I wondered if I mistakenly thought there were others to start with, but couldn't be. I definitely saw the arm resting on the armrest, its white silhouette against the bright screen. It was a tiny screen room with 90 seats only, and if anybody had left before me, it was impossible for me not to have noticed it. Confused, I stepped towards the front exit. It felt like the fantasy world of the film was extending into real life even after it was over. Then I saw the cleaning staff entering from the back door. She casually glanced over row by row and stopped at where I had sat, tidied and dusted the seat, then carried on just glancing over other rows, and then got out through the back door again. I felt all the hair standing on end. Whether it was really a paranormal experience or just my mistake, I don't want to feel like that ever again, and I never go to an empty cinema now. I once worked part-time at a cinema, or to be exact, as an outsourced security crew to the cinema. The cinema was a part of a big mall that opened 24/7, so it was impossible to completely close down the space. It had happened occasionally, a homeless or a teenager sneaking into the lobby to sleep on the benches or play around the space, so my job was basically to make sure there was no such trespassers after closing. My routine checkup included every corner of the cinema except for the ladies' room. The protocol dictated that I call out from the outside and wait for any reaction. The physical check-in could only be done by a cleaning lady. So that night too, shortly after the last screening of the day, I went to the ladies' room and called out, "Is anybody in?"
No, there isn't.
A woman replied in clearly very much upbeat tone. Maybe a customer from the last screening, I assumed. I radioed that there was somebody in the ladies' room and would make sure that she come out before I move on with the rest of my routine. It was pretty boring to wait in front of the toilet in otherwise dark hallway. Now, almost half an hour passed, but there was no sign that she should come out anytime soon. Considering her joking tone earlier, she was probably drunk and possibly passed out in there. If it were the men's room, I could just walk in, but for the ladies' room, I could be in trouble if the woman inside should accuse me of sexual assault also. "Hello? Are you still there?" I called out again, but there was no reply this time. I radioed the situation and they sent a cleaning lady to check in. But she came out with a questioning face. "But there isn't anybody," she said. "Are you sure?" I said. "I am. I checked all the cubicles too." I couldn't believe it and even went into the ladies' room ignoring the protocol for once. And no, there wasn't anybody. But what was it then that replied to me earlier? When I finished that night's shift and laid myself down on bed, I realized something and huffed to myself. Well, at least she didn't lie. Last year I worked part-time at a cinema for a few months. The cinema was rather old and small, which actually made the job easier for the staffs. One day I was on the last shift of the day. If no ticket was sold for the last screening, I could have finished the day earlier, but well, there was one audience, unfortunately. About 30 minutes into the screening, the audience came out and complained that there was somebody walking around and shouting in the screening room. But he was the only audience. I explained only one ticket was sold for the last screening and he was the only audience. But he seemed to think I was lying. He angrily insisted that I should do something about it or give him a refund. I was scared, but a job is a job, so went into the screening room to check. Nothing and nobody other than the film running in the empty room. I reported it back to the audience, but he wouldn't still buy it. He insisted to check on the surveillance camera, and in the end I had to radio the manager to check the record from the surveillance. And indeed, it showed nobody else entering the screening room other than the audience himself. He seemed to be finally a bit spooked out too, but got his refund in anyway. I have no idea what it was that he saw. Maybe the audience was just a nuisance looking to make a trouble for no reason, but it definitely made it a bit creepier to work there for the rest of the time. I love movies, so I used to enjoy going to cinema even by myself. On an off day, I would spend the whole day at a cinema watching one film after another. But it all changed one day when I was 22. I met friends in town that day, but the gathering wrapped up still early in the evening. It felt a bit too early to go back home, so I went to a nearby cinema. Most titles on the show had I watched already, and only thing left was a Japanese horror film titled Reincarnation. I don't mind watching a horror film by myself either, so I settled down with a big box of popcorn and soda. The screen room was rather empty, probably not even 10 people. I took a seat at almost the last row, so I could get a good overview of the auditorium. The film was unfortunately a disappointment. I found it boring all the way through, except for the last scene with a doll. On top of that, somebody sitting behind me kept constantly mumbling something, disturbing my concentration. It was a weird voice too. Young, probably about 20-something old, male voice, but had something metallic, grinding quality to it. I tried my best ignoring it for the longest time, but curiosity got better of me. I focused what the heck this weird guy was saying.
I think you hear me.
I think you hear me. I think you hear me. I think you hear me. Don't you? Don't you? Don't you? Don't you? Gonna run away. Run away. Gonna 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 run away. Now, the whispering voice came once closer, then farther away, then on the right side and left side the next. I think I half passed out. Only at the last doll scene I came around, and when the light came back on in the room, I tried my best to keep the straight face and got out quickly. I don't know what it was and don't really want to know either, but that was the last time I visited a cinema by myself. I worked at the cinema when Halloween the film was first released in Korea. I normally worked during the day, but that day I happened to fill in for the last shift of the day. The midnight screening finished at almost 2 o'clock a.m. Then I opened the door to make sure everybody leaving the screening room. I quickly checked how many were there and counted 8 people, 5 in the middle, 2 on the side, and 1 at the last row. I greeted "Have a good night" at the door to the audience leaving, when I felt a sudden chill. I realized only 7 people left. What was taking so long, I grumbled to myself, and walked to the front of the screen to look over the auditorium. There was nobody left in the seats. But what's that? There was a woman in a white dress, sitting on the wall-mounted speaker. She was shaking her head, giggling. I just ran out, mumbling, "Oh shit," to myself in a low voice. I didn't remember anybody in white dress among the audience to that last screening. Besides, the speaker was quite high up on the wall, and it would have been impossible to climb up there. Later I learned I wasn't the only one who saw something weird. That particular screening room was already notorious for being haunted, and that it always kept about 1.5 degrees chillier than all the other rooms for some reason. Following story describes a true suicide case. Viewer discretion is advised. July 3rd, 2005. The screening of the Amityville Horror just finished at a cinema in Busan. The cinema staff, Hong, came into the screening room to check if everybody left the room, and found a woman still sitting in the middle of the third row. She was slumped down, and at first Hong thought she must have dozed off. But no. It was all bloody about her neck, and in her hand was a knife. It was immediately reported to the police, but the woman was already dead. According to the police investigation, there was no obvious sign of foul play. The auditorium was about half full that day with 58 people. Most of them were sitting at the rows behind the dead, and none of them reported having seen anything unusual. The knife used was a small kitchen knife, and there was no will or note left. According to the dead woman's parents, her marriage ended after financial difficulty and violence from her husband. She seemed to have suffered depression after that and was reported to have often said she'd rather die. The police concluded it to be a suicide based on the dead woman's history of depression and that the knife used was from the deceased's own kitchen. But there are a few strange points that can't be clearly explained. 1. The deceased was a right-hander, but the knife was found in a left hand. 2. Killing oneself by slashing is very unusual. Unlike a gunshot, it takes a long time, and one has to suffer the pain the whole time too. Why did she choose this uncomfortable way, and in such a public place as cinema? 3. Relating to the previous point, how could none of 58 audience in the same room fail to notice any moan or commotion from what must have been a slow and painful death? 4. The seat she died on was seat number 60 in the 6th screening room on the 6th floor of the building, making it 666, so-called number of the beast. It must have been a mere coincidence, but combining with the fact she particularly chose a horror film with a demonic element as the backdrop, it makes this already odd case more chilling. Most of weird stories and sightings from cinemas tend to be short anecdotes. Here's the collection of a few interesting cases. In one multiplex cinema, there was a short stretch of stair steps leading to the screening rooms, and frequently people slipped and fell while walking up that stairs, at least 10 cases a week. It was reported to the management, and even some engineers were called in for inspections, but no clear reason could be determined. In the end, they just had to resolve with a warning sign and fluorescent tapes to make the steps more clearly visible. But similar incident continued. And one day, a staff reported what she heard from an audience. He looked down at the seemingly empty steps and said, "Oi kid, stop trapping people there." A friend works as a projectionist at a cinema. One day he came to work for the morning shift and found a book left at one corner of the projection booth. No, actually, there were books at every other corner too. And they were Bibles. He asked other staffs where they were from. And apparently the female projectionist who worked the last shift the previous night brought and put them there. But she refused to tell others why. For a time I worked as an usher at a cinema. One day a single seat was sold for a midnight screening. Screening started, but nobody turned up. Just in case he or she come in late, the screening continued, and I came into the room from the back door for the routine screen check, and saw a woman sitting at the first row. She was wearing scarlet red dress and turned her head backwards to stare at me, even though the main program had already started. I didn't want to think she was a ghost. I finished the routine check and came out to the lobby. When I came back when the screening finished, there was nobody. I was in charge of checking the ticket at the entrance too, and I assure you nobody came to the screening that night. Then, who was that woman? One day I went to a cinema with a friend. During the screening, I was kept disturbed by a person sitting behind me, kicking the back of my seat repeatedly. I let it pass a while, but in the end turned back to give an eye and show my irritation. And at that same time, my friend next to me also looked back. Apparently, she's been putting up with the same thing. We whispered to each other how annoying it was. Then we felt yet another big bang to our seats, and we were about to look back and shout at whoever that was behind us, when we noticed virtually everybody in the auditorium all looking back, almost at the same time. It wasn't just us who felt the kick to their chair. It created quite a commotion, and many claimed for refund in the end. I worked as an usher at the cinema. One of my jobs was checking route from the emergency exit because some people occasionally sneaked in through there for a free viewing. One night I got a radio from the security that somebody came in through the emergency exit on the 7th floor and was wandering up and down the hallway. I went up and checked around, but didn't find anybody. I radioed back there was nobody, and the security replied,
"What are you talking about? I can see right now from the surveillance camera that somebody's walking right next to you."
I screamed and ran all the way to the lobby. Just in case you suspect, the radio line was monitored by our manager too, and the security guy wouldn't have dared to prank me there. One night, I met a friend. We were both nicely tipsy after a drink and decided to go to see a midnight screening. About midway to the film, a woman came in and sat behind us. I didn't care, but soon the woman seemed to be mumbling something to herself. I tried to put up with it. She might be just a bit mad or something. But when the film reached a quiet moment, I could hear what she was saying. Meaningless but creepy, endless gibberish. I creeped out so much that I could not focus on the film anymore. My friend must have felt the same, and he just grabbed my arm and said, "Hey, let's go." We got up, and I checked our back row to see who that creepy woman was. There wasn't anybody. Actually, we were the only audience there. A friend of mine worked at a snack bar in a cinema. One day she was sweeping around the popcorn machine. It was just a routine cleaning at the end of the day. And from the underneath the popcorn machine came out long hairs and nails. Not nail clippings, but full nails seemingly pulled straight out from fingers. She creeped out but kept sweeping out endless flow of hairs until a whole bunch of it came out. She screamed and just dropped everything. About 10 years ago, I went to see a late-night screening. That screening room had just one back door, which was the main entrance, and an emergency exit at one side. By the time I entered through the back door, the film had already started. I stood a while till my eyes got used to the darkness. The seats were almost full, and I realized to take my designated seat in the middle, I'd have to disturb many. I just decided rather to take an empty seat at one corner. Then came a bright and quiet landscape scene in the film, and I unwittingly looked around the auditorium and found there were actually barely 10 people. And the row with my designated seat was totally empty too. But what was it that I saw at the beginning then? Just it so happened that the program was a horror film too. I could not focus on the film the rest of the time and got out of there fast as soon as it finished. Hi, it's Anthony here, and thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed today's stories. I don't go to cinemas that often, but I do enjoy when I do. Haven't been in one for quite some time due to what's going on in the world. The other day I borrowed a home projector from a friend to watch a film and realized how much I missed the real cinema experience, even if I should share it with a ghost or two. Do you like going to cinemas? What was the show you saw the last? Any interesting experience from one, whether paranormal or plain weird? Do let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed my video, please give it a like and a comment, and do consider subscribing to my channel. If you are a fan of Korea and its culture, or just general horror and mystery genre, my channel brings you stories straight from Korean web. I'll come back with something different next Sunday. Stay safe and take care.